Hello and welcome to a new episode here for HNet's H Soul Wars new podcast series on Soul War history books. And we are today coming from the depths of the bayou. You can't see it. I'm actually wearing my Ragin' Cajun shirt for today. And we are down south of New Orleans and Lafitte, Louisiana. And joining us is Caryn Cossé Bell. She is a native of Louisiana, but she is also a professor emeritus from the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Very nice place. A lot of history up there. And she is the author also of Revolution, Romanticism, and the Afro-Creole protest tradition in Louisiana, 1718 to 1868. And today we are going to talk with her about Creole New Orleans. Today we're going to talk with her about Creole New Orleans in the revolutionary Atlantic world, 1775 to 1877, which came out in October of 2023 with Louisiana State University Press. So first of all, thank you so much for taking a little time from Mardi Gras to join me today, Caryn. And let's just go right into it. How did you come to write a book, or I should say another book, about New Orleans, Creoles, and sort of the revolutionary Atlantic region?
This book is the culmination of a lifetime of study. In my undergraduate work, I was fascinated by the French Revolution and the American Revolution and civil rights here in Louisiana. And so the book brings those things together. And it's been a wonderful education for me. I've learned so much from writing it, things I never dreamed of. So it's been very, very productive study. And one of the things that was very valuable was the French language sources
Mm.
that are here and elsewhere that I was able to tap and just barely scratch the surface. So it's wonderful in that way that there's so much yet to be done
Mm.
about Louisiana history and New Orleans history. When I was at the beginning, I read a book by Vincent Harding. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He published a book in 1981.
Mhm.
And the title of his book was There is a River, The Black Struggle for Freedom in America. And he wrote this in his wonderful book. Um, Of course, and this is he's referring to antebellum New Orleanians, Black
Mhm.
New Orleanians. He's saying, of course, revolutionary change was precisely what was necessary to advance authentic Black freedom.
Mhm.
And nowhere in the South did Black people speak more clearly or insist more adamantly on the need for radical post-war change than in New Orleans. And so that's essentially the story that I came to tell. And the bringing together the revolutionary era, which was enormously
Mhm.
impactful. And that story with New Orleans, the New Orleans story. And so in France was enormously
Mhm.
important here,
Yeah.
France. So those three things, Haiti,
Yeah.
France, and the city. So that's what I ended up with, and I ended up with a lot of surprises too. I had
Oh yeah.
no I had no idea that the that Haitians have played and continue to play
Mhm.
such an important role in our history. So that was quite an education for me. The first hints came. I don't know how long you want me to go on with this.
I would say let's kind of go and kind of explore some of these subjects as you kind of, because you already like half of the points that I want to talk in more detail about you're already mentioning. So it's sort of like, oh my gosh, there's so much that you have in your book, which is why
Uh-huh.
I found it so fascinating. Um, but let's talk first about the source material because I think that really like it's the first thing you say in the book, and it's one of the first really kind of important aspects that we have, right? So why do you think previous scholars just didn't pay attention to these French, Francophone, like materials? Like, why not? Like it like for me, I'm looking at it, it's like it should be a no-brainer that you touch this stuff. It's Louisiana, it's a French former colony.
Uh-huh. Well, it's the language barrier, of course.
Mm,
It's absolutely the language barrier. And ideally, someone who wanted to really dig in more deeply than I did,
mhm,
Spanish, French, and English are the languages, you would
mhm.
ideally want to speak. So
Right.
it's quite a challenge. And I mean, in recent years, it's gotten worse
That's
because
crazy.
language education
Mhm.
uh, is come under considerable uh, I mean, the language departments. And
Yeah.
so it's not seen. In fact, it's seen in some areas as being subversive to speak a foreign language, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
In some
Especially
areas
with
in this
certain
country.
languages. Yeah.
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 So given all of that, I'm not hopeful that things are going to improve in the future.
Mm. Yeah.
But let's hope for the best.
Yes. Before the interview, we already talked a bit about we let our pessimist side out a little bit before
Right,
the
right,
interview. So,
right. Yeah, yeah.
but it, I totally agree. Like it's graduate programs should do a lot better with sort of language education in kind of
Requirements.
and requirements because it
I would
is
say.
really
Yeah,
important.
right.
Now we're like, where did you find these? Like, were these documents all in Louisiana, or did you have to travel to like France itself to actually find these sources?
Some of, some of it I traveled to France, which was
Mhm.
wonderful.
Oh yeah,
Made
Paris,
several
right?
trips. Yeah, several trips, but the northern coast,
Oh yeah.
what do they call it? The armor.
Like Normandy.
No, no, north of that, where all the corsairs,
Oh,
their
the
ship.
Breton,
Ah, and
Bretagne.
um, so it's beautiful, so varied.
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time at Nacional, and but there are a lot of courses here too. I
Mm-hmm.
I found the interesting battle between two doctors. It
Mm-hmm.
says my internet connection is unstable, so I'll just cancel that out. But these doctors, and they argued in French. They were like a pre-Civil War, and they continued after Reconstruction. One of them was pro-slavery white supremacist,
Oh,
and the other was this
yes.
great humanitarian and yellow
Yeah.
fever expert internationally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they went back, and it's all in French. And
Mm-hmm.
so it would be, and again, I only scratched the surface, but
Right.
that's one story. That's something that really fascinates my audiences, is
Mm-hmm.
that dynamic that occurred in the medical, the
Mm-hmm.
influence of the French Revolution
Yeah.
on the doctors here, because there were two famous doctors here. There were many doctors here educated in France, but these two doctors, one was Afro-Creole and the other one was white, and they were allies.
Mm-hmm.
And both had interracial practices,
Yeah.
and they were educated in the medical school, the Faculté de Médecine Paris, in which students were taught that in order to cure patients, you must first confront tyranny and slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because that way you could then be able to cure the patient. And
Yeah.
so that's a way of thinking that they brought home with them. The Afro-Creole doctor was a medical student there with his colleague, Dr. Charles Farget. And he experienced the 1848 revolution. He was at the
Mm,
barricades there before things fell apart in
yeah.
the 1848 revolution. But he was there and he was convinced that if you can do it here, they abolished slavery during the 1848 revolution,
Mm,
abolished slavery, and they
mhm,
extended the franchise to the former slaves and
yeah.
all men of color so could vote, and they voted representatives into the National Assembly. So Dr. Roudanet, Charles de Roudanet, was very impressed with that,
Mm,
and he believed that he could do the same thing here in Louisiana. After
right.
all, Louisiana at the time was or I should say, the United States was the largest slaveholding country in the world.
Yeah.
So, I mean, by the time that they were attending medical school, slavery was really coming under
Mhm,
greater and greater attack. So it was
yeah.
reasonable, it seems to me, to believe that, yeah, slavery is going to fall apart in the United States too.
Right. And that just shows like it kind of like I want to talk more about the doctors a little bit later, but
Mhm.
it felt like one of the really engaging aspects of your book was that you found all of these personal stories and you kind of pursued some and you kind of teased out what they did, where they came from, like
Mhm.
like how important was it to you in the writing to find and personalize this narrative as much as you could?
It was wonderful. I mean, it's been a wonderful experience for me. Um, there was so much I didn't know. I didn't know. In fact, I don't know if I've mentioned this already, but one of the biggest revelations to me was the migration of Haitians into New Orleans. They doubled the
Mm,
size of the city in
right.
1809 and 1810. And so that was pretty amazing there. And
Mm,
then just a year later, there was the largest slave revolt just south of Louisiana. Uh, and it was believed that it was led by a Haitian slave, a slave from Haiti.
mm,
So in those words, the revolution, the the Haitian Revolution enormously
yeah,
impacted the city. For one thing, it fortified the three caste racial order that existed in the city.
yeah.
And again, the largest slave revolt in the United States occurred there.
Hmm.
And then in 1804 and 1815, Haiti's refugee soldiers joined in the city
Hmm.
with other Atlantic world itinerant revolutionaries from the
Yeah,
rest of revolutionary Europe, the French, the Spaniards,
yeah.
all had fought in the revolutionary upheavals. And so these itinerant revolutionaries had aspirations for a new world order. And
Yeah.
so that pitted them against Europe's power. So they came to fight the British in New Orleans in the Battle of New Orleans. And then after that, um,
Go
they moved
everywhere.
everywhere. They moved
Yeah.
everywhere.
But,
And hundreds of soldiers
mhm,
from Haiti entered Louisiana at the time of the at the time of these migrations around 1809. And they were viewed as very dangerous people by the
mhm.
planters, the white slaveholding planters.
And if
And
I
so,
may intercede there, because that group was really fascinating because you had like I think it was the Keene family where it's like they lived in Saint Domingue, which was like Haiti's and then they go to Jamaica, uh,
mhm,
and then they
they
come
fled
to
directions.
yeah, then they've come to to Louisiana, smuggled in through Lafitte's pirate network, and then appear here and assume a community leadership role. And it's like part of me as I was reading this was like, how did you find this? How did you find all of these details of like where they went, how they stopped, and like just Lafitte, like you would think like he's engaging in illegal stuff. There wouldn't be records of it. How did you find all that?
Um, I used a woman's history book. She wrote a history,
Hmm.
a memoir,
Yeah.
Helene Daquin Alain, and there's a lot. Her family was very influential in New Orleans, and they were influential in Saint-Domingue as well. And so there were a lot of I could use different things to piece her life history together and
Hmm.
her. So it was a matter of just digging up,
Yeah.
different aspects of her life. And then her life was like how do you say? It was the spine of this book.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Because she linked all of these people.
Everything. Yeah.
Yeah, she linked all of these people. So her book was a virtual roadmap of the Revolutionary era in the
Mm.
city.
And it was also fascinating, and I wonder if you can, like, you treat Atlanta's memoir or book, however we want to define this, very different from previous scholars because you point out that many previous individuals looking at the book were like extremely dismissive, that they were like, nah, this is useless. This is just
Mhm.
some personal ramblings, and you're
Yeah.
giving it a lot of credit instead.
Yeah. Actually, not all scholars looked at it.
That's true.
African American scholars were the first to seize on it
Hmm.
and to point out the symbols. She discusses the dancing, the proverbs, the uh, character of the people. She describes some of them in great detail. An African woman was a member of the household uh, who fled the revolution, uh, right, their family.
Hmm.
And so, and remained, they will remain life with them. And a free woman of color from actually New Orleans who was sent to Jamaica to help support the family. But again, there are fascinating descriptions of these people, and
Hmm.
also the culture in the city. She's described that, Congo Square and how fascinated she was with the African peoples, the
Hmm.
various peoples from different nations,
Hmm.
African nations. And one thing she studies was Moreau Saint-Méry. I don't know if know him, but he wrote a voluminous history of the Haitian Revolution right on the eve, a voluminous history of Haiti, rather, Saint-Domingue, I'm sorry. A voluminous history of Saint-Domingue. Her family was in that history. And so I
Hmm.
found information in there.
Yeah.
And she studied it and she read it and she copied 39 pages of that book into her own book.
Hmm.
And it dealt with the Africans and African Creole
Hmm.
folks. And so it was like she saw in that book uh, New Orleans and all the different African
Hmm.
peoples and such, and their customs and their
Yeah.
religious practices too. Uh, so that was very interesting. The mesmerism, the mesmerism, spiritualism, different that were practiced, likewise practiced in Haiti, I should
Hmm.
say, Haiti,
Yeah.
Haiti. I'm sorry, Saint-Domingue. And so that's pretty interesting. And
Hmm.
so African scholars, Black scholars, like I mentioned Charles, maybe I didn't, but he was an scholar writing in 1930. He published his first book. And in that, he, you know, got a book and thought and remarks. And John Blassing, I don't know if you're familiar, you might have a study.
Yes.
You want to take a look at that for sure. And so um, African American scholars did know what she wrote and were very fascinated and overcame
Hmm.
the language barrier because it's never translated. And so
Hmm.
overcame that barrier to include her work in their studies.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, I mean, I already said it was very fascinating in so many regards. What what she had to tell and how like the family moved and evolved and intermarried and it it got to the point where you sometimes were like losing track of how much they were interacting and related to one another and where everyone
Mhm.
was and it
Yeah.
it seemed like that Saint Domingue based refugee community in Louisiana was a very
Uh,
close knit group.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, they maintained their ties to their relatives in France.
Yeah.
Okay. So they maintained all this network, godparentage, kinship ties.
Hmm.
Some of the at least one of the soldiers, I'm sure there were more, in the migration of the soldiers into Louisiana were related to the other soldiers
Right.
in the
Right.
in the so there was enormous interracial mixing in Saint-Domingue and in New
Hmm.
Orleans as well. And so there were all of these ties in France, so all of these
Hmm.
ties were maintained. And of course, as the Anglo-American influence took over with its very oppressive slave regime,
Hmm.
that changed.
Yeah.
Uh, it became unwelcome and
Hmm.
considered dangerous for you to be
Yeah.
so closely tied, especially in a kinship relationship
Hmm.
to the enslaved population. So,
Right. And it's you already mentioned it, but there's also a lot of interracial interaction that we're seeing within this community too, which in New Orleans was okay initially, but once the United States takes over and racial laws become more strict, it
mhm,
becomes much more difficult to.
right. And that's an interesting point because one of the refugees, the white refugee, I guess, I mean, who knows, but a white refugee, he was accepted as white. He viewed himself as
Mhm.
white, but his name was Morrill Islet, and what he did he was brilliant. He could speak all three languages. So he had that gift. And the
That is a
territorial
gift.
governor at the time of his entry recognized immediately that he was just the man he needed to sort out the legal system in
Mhm.
Louisiana because he could speak, it was just a babble of the
Right.
different languages, civil law,
Mhm.
common law, Spanish, French,
Yeah.
English. And so Claiborne, the territorial governor of Louisiana, immediately hired him.
Yeah.
And so he was the lead architect of
Mhm.
the Louisiana Civil Code, the first Louisiana Civil Code. And he sorted out through all the languages and he blended the civil with the common. And so
Mhm.
it came out very much like Claiborne liked it.
Mhm.
But And then Claiborne made him a judge. And that influential position allowed him to reinforce the three-caste racial order. Okay.
Mhm. Right.
And so that protected the free population of color to which many of the refugees, to whom many of the
Mhm.
refugees were related, and
Yeah.
possibly himself.
Yeah.
But it gave the free population of color the ability, many of the rights of citizens,
Mhm.
they could uh, uh, charge, they could, how do you say it?
They
Uh,
like bring lawsuits, right? And
right, bring lawsuits,
yeah.
right. And acquire property.
Mhm.
And so that by the time of the Civil War, Louisiana's free population was by far the richest in the United States.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was a very big, they could acquire, enter into contracts and acquire
Mhm.
property and uh, make contracts, testify in all sorts of cases, even against
Mhm.
whites. So many of the rights of citizens were accorded them by virtue of his decision.
Right.
And so and I thought that nothing was extended to the enslaved. But I'm beginning to think that that's probably not the case,
Oh.
that the Latin European, some aspects of the Latin European laws were adapted and also
Oh.
benefited the slaves.
That's a
So
good research project for the future.
exactly. And in fact,
Huh.
I'm getting ready to go to the Louisiana Historical Association And the way that I'm learning about this is see these students, these three
Yeah.
students who are investigating that topic. And I have some questions for them to see
Oh, where
how
are
that
they? Where do they study? At LSU or
slavery. Oh,
no, you're those three students you're thinking about.
I can't think off the top of my head,
Oh,
the
no,
conference is coming up in about a month
yeah.
or so.
I was gonna say,
So,
say hello to like Mike Martin and Mary Farmer Kaiser if you run into them. They
this
were
sometimes.
Mike Martin was the kind of very influential person at University of Louisiana when I was
Oh,
there.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
he was the God, did he run the it's gonna be embarrassing being on tape saying this, but I think he ran the yeah, either ran a Louisiana Study Center or the journal and organization for like a few years.
No, I'll
So
definitely. And that's at the
yeah,
university. That's at Life.
Yeah, yeah. He's
Okay.
not
Let's see.
sure.
Were you at Lafayette then?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I was down there, not LSU.
Okay.
Yeah, I was Judy Gentry's student.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, I know her.
yeah. She's well known. She was
Yeah.
wonderful as an advisor.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it but I, I'm I will keep an eye on that. That sounds very interesting as a
Uh-huh.
topic. But
Yeah.
there's one thing, of course, where there was major change that you do mention quite a bit in the book, and that was the militia law and
Yes.
the ability of military service for African American or Afro Caribbean, if you want, in the
Hmm.
state.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, there were hundreds of armed itinerant soldiers from Saint-Domingue, Haiti, who fought in the revolution, in the Haitian Revolution, who migrated into eventually into Louisiana.
Mm,
They weren't allowed, they were barred from entering.
right.
So they entered, as you mentioned, surreptitiously. I don't know exactly how, probably Lafitte. Uh,
That's a still
but
fascinating
migrated.
aspect.
Yeah, they migrated to Mexico where they fought they set out on a number of expeditions to
Mhm.
Mexico to support Mexican independence. And in one instance, in a couple of instances, in fact, they were led by the French Revolutionary General,
Mm,
uh, yes,
yeah,
General Humbert.
all
And
connected.
right, and they also, a number of them also joined with Louis, the Corsair, the Jacobin Corsair,
Mm,
Louis, oh, I can't think of his name, Louis Auret.
all right.
And Auret had close contacts with the president of Haiti at that time, who was
Mm,
Alexander Pétion. And
yes, that
Pétion
was
was offering,
fascinating.
yeah, he's offering men in arms to uh, the independence
Hmm.
fighters if they would abolish slavery in the lands that they captured. And so that was the arrangement. And another fascinating subject that would be wonderful to explore. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but Louis Auret sailed mostly with black sailors.
Hmm.
And not only did he do that, but the ship said he was a superb, he's written in all the Latin American history books, but not ours or
Yeah,
anybody else's, it appears. But he's very famous for assisting in independence in Latin America.
yeah.
And so that would be a wonderful subject. And he sailed with virtually all black crews. And
Hmm.
if he recruited, in one instance that I could see, he stopped a slave ship and
Right.
recruited them onto his ship and made them sailors. And what interests me most about all that is that the ships that they seized, were captained by his lieutenants who were black. And
Oh
so there
yeah.
was these black sea captains with their black crews, and uh, And
Mm,
Parotin Dumont has studied him somewhat and called him the Jacobin Corsair with good reason. And
right,
so I think that that would be a very, very wonderful. It's I don't know if it can be done to get at
right.
the sources and such, but it would be a very worthwhile project.
Yeah. And but part of what you're saying here too is that there's a fear of revolution that we're seeing eventually by like the 1820s, 1830s in all of the Americas, that where is this going to lead us?
Hmm.
These you have African, Afro-Caribbean, African American men and women who are rebelling like on ships, on plantation economies to kind of gain their freedom. You have this whole new independence movement that tons of new states are appearing. So it you have this massive fear, right? That really contributes to this perception of like, ooh, is it a good idea to keep um African American or Afro-Caribbean, whichever way we want to take this, men under arms in Louisiana? And
Uh-huh.
it's sort of odd to see that when you consider that they were such a prominent force during the Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, they wanted to be rewarded with citizenship,
yeah,
fighting in the Battle of New Orleans, and Jackson said no, and you can't be citizens. And so they went off to find places where they could, but
right.
they came back. Some of them came back, of
Yeah.
course, and remained there until, and were buried there and buried
Hmm.
here in New Orleans. And that's another project. I'd like to know where Joseph Savory, the head of all these men, was. These men
Hmm.
were very well armed, and they doubtlessly were uniformed in the uniforms of French soldiers. And
Hmm.
the so it would be interesting to study. The You mentioned that the 1834, the militia was ended, right? The black
Hmm.
militia.
Yeah.
The legislature wanted to end that because it was considered so dangerous. And it was ended in 1834, but they just went underground with their guns and every other, because when the Civil War commenced,
Hmm.
uh,
All
they were
right,
invited
back.
to parade. They were invited to parade with the white
Yeah.
soldiers. And they had all these heavy arms that
Hmm.
terrified citizens. And so they were uh, uh, let go as if
Right.
they weren't invited back.
Yeah.
And so they maintained their militia. And I think that was an important protection for them. And
Hmm.
absolutely. And not so much that they knew it was a protection, but I think other people knew it was a protection too.
Hmm.
The militias were ended in 1834, and that is exactly the year that their important ally who got them into the Battle of New Orleans in the first place, Charles Louis, I'm sorry, uh, um, Daquin, Louis
Yeah.
Charles Daquin. It was his uh, pressure that
Hmm.
got Jackson, and of course Jackson could see, that they were recommended by other people to these soldiers who were so successful.
Hmm.
And so that together with Savory's recommendation, and in this struggle, the whites accused Savory of being black, and so of course that was a very, but he apparently it had no effect on him. He was well
Yeah.
connected,
Yeah.
and so it just appears to have rolled off his back, and he remained
Mm.
successful.
Yeah.
And when he died, that ended the militia, the
Right.
Free Black Militia.
Yeah.
Although again, they remained, yeah, wedded
It's
to their arms and
kind of like
took
an
care of their
interesting
own.
underground movement to study of
Yes,
like the
yes,
rebelliousness, but
yes,
not outward so much
right,
rebellion.
right,
But I also
right.
found fascinating that I forget when it was, like I think it was like 1835 or so. You said that Jackson comes back and he actually makes a point of meeting with those veterans of his who were African.
Yes, yes. That's 1844. He was
Oh,
coming back that
close
for
by a
to,
decade.
he was coming back. Jackson came back to visit friends. He made
Yeah.
very good friends in New Orleans. And he there was the monument to Jackson, the horse
Hmm.
Jackson
Yeah.
Square.
Yeah.
And so he came back for that. And yes, I mean, men-at-arms appear to develop very strong ties with one
Yeah.
another.
Yeah.
And so that was the case. And Jackson is described as weeping
Mm.
at meeting them and this recollection of
Yeah.
their success. I
Right.
mean, yeah, his success at New Orleans. And Savory, well, Savory was dead by then,
Hmm.
but Savory was very important. Savory and Daquin together were very important to the success at the Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah.
So Jackson, I know, always appreciated that. I'm sure he did.
Right. I mean, we don't want to go too far with Jackson, and like, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is sort of a brotherhood in arms that
Exactly.
forged this, because I mean,
Exactly.
Jackson is a slaveholder and
Exactly.
does very
Yes,
bad things towards Native Americans, but
exactly.
they're
And,
glimpses.
and actually, you can read that back in history because the Savory family and the Daquin family were
Hmm.
closely allied in Saint-Domingue.
Right.
And if you look at the population distribution, I mean, 90% of the population in Saint-Domingue was African.
Yeah.
And so that these Daquin and Alain, they formed a fellowship there as well,
Right.
given what they were facing in Saint-Domingue.
Yeah. Yeah. The hardships that they had to overcome. Um, let's see here. I let's pivot over because you already mentioned them, and I do want to talk a little bit about the graduates from Paris Medical, because I thought
Oh,
so
yeah.
that was just again like the whole, like everything about it. I have to admit, I was not, history of medicine is not my area. I have not read much about it, but it was just fascinating to have these French educated doctors who see equality in France. They're not treated differently over there.
Yes, yes,
Come
right.
back and like do like phenomenal things to improve the lot of everyone in the
Hmm.
city, or in
Hmm.
the region, I should say.
Hmm. Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. Dr. Fauché, in addition to his work in yellow fever, which was amazing, and again, he was internationally recognized for that, was also introduced anesthetic into women's
Mm-hmm.
labor room.
Yeah,
At that
that was
time, women couldn't even be, maybe a little bit earlier than the mid 1840s, but women couldn't be examined by male doctors. And so women were in France, in France, of course, that was done, and so
right.
they had a very considerable understanding about delivery and
Yeah,
delivering babies and C-sections and things like that. That was interesting to me too.
yeah.
In fact,
Like,
I'd like to do more along those lines. But yeah, so Dr. Fauché was just a phenomenon.
mm-hmm.
Introducing again, I said anesthesia into the delivery room and finding diagnostic tools to determine if someone
Mm-hmm.
had yellow fever or
Yeah.
maybe they had cholera. And so he developed a way of determining, and that's very important to be able to diagnose that yellow fever. Because if you treated someone with cholera, you thought they had yellow fever and they had something else, typhus maybe or something,
Mhm.
then you could kill them with the treatment,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So that was an important development. So, but he didn't find the ultimate weapon against
Right.
yellow fever,
Yeah.
but he was part of the process of the
Mm-hmm.
work that went into diagnosis and treatment. He had some success in treatment. So Uh, but he didn't think. He thought the only way you can survive yellow fever is to get it and survive. And if you
Right,
survive,
immunization sort of.
right, yeah. So, but Dr. Rudinet, his colleague in all of this, was equally extraordinary
Hmm.
uh, to the extent that he campaigned and persisted and never let go, always.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, his dream of seeing slavery abolished, as in the 1848 revolution, which he
Right.
witnessed,
Yeah.
and also of seeing African Americans
Hmm.
exercise citizenship rights, the right to vote and to be part, to be citizens in a democratic republic. So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
but the other parts that I found extremely interesting with the medical material of yours was that like in part we'll try to go back to it when we get to the Civil War in a minute, but just this like the yellow fever and like Benjamin Butler becomes sort of the savior and the fixer of it. But you
I
also
love
have I'm gonna try and see if where I have it in my notes, but it's sort of like there was sort of a conversation where your French educated doctor was like, no, the science says this is what happens, this is how we treat it. And then you have
uh-huh.
this other doctor who's saying, like, no,
Exactly.
don't believe that. That's total
Yeah.
bogus.
Yeah.
And it's like
That,
it felt so much when I
yeah.
read that, like the whole thing about the COVID pandemic, and people are like,
Yes, yes,
no, no,
yes.
no, no, don't believe the doctors. The doctors
Yeah.
are totally
Yeah.
wrong. And the doctors are like,
Right.
trust us.
Yeah. Um, that was Dr. Dellery, who was practicing a awful form of medicine, which was based on white supremacy.
Yeah.
And it was really malfeasance in medicine. And he and Dr. Fauché argued for decades here
Mm,
over yellow fever and the proper treatment and things like that. It was all in French. Dr.
mhm.
Fauché spoke only French.
Yeah.
And so some of his colleagues would translate his work so that the Anglophone doctors could read it. But Dr. Dellery had no interest whatsoever. I mean, they were at loggerheads. I mean, they were fought bitterly. At one point, Dr. Dellery challenged Dr. Fauché to a duel, but Dr. Fauché was a devout Catholic, and I can't do that. It's against my morals to do that. But they fought bitterly before the Civil War, and they fought bitterly after the Civil War.
Right.
And there's a whole, I don't know if anybody would want to do it, but these guys, Dr. Dellery and his allies, wrote these horrible attacks on the Reconstruction government.
Hmm.
Terrible, terrible attacks. And no one's ever uh, tapped into those
Mm. That sounds
or
like an
utilize them, but they're so awful. I mean, they're
right.
really terrible. They attack Butler and
Yeah.
uh, all of the top Black leadership in the city. So,
Yeah. It feels like we're offering grad students a lot of ideas of what to study in the future. Of like what's
yeah,
untapped material that if you speak a
I
little
mean, it's
French, wow.
wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
And it's like, when like I remember my professor colleague of mine in Middle Georgia who was like, everything has been told about the Civil War.
Oh.
And we all looked at him every time and we're like, no, not really, Bob, but whatever. But it's like this is exactly right. There's so many facets and stories that we still
Uh-huh.
haven't and we don't understand quite yet.
Right.
That
The other
that's the
the other thing that Dr. Faget did was to practice interracial medicine.
Yeah,
And
I
so
was gonna
that he
ask that.
treated the nuns, the
Hmm.
Haitian the Haitian Revolution's refugees.
Hmm.
Some women formed a Black convent in New
Yeah.
Orleans, and that was Dr. Roudenet's one of his charities. He devoted himself to
Hmm.
that and helped to found the Order of Nuns. And Faget treated them, and so that he was their doctor. And then when they were the second order of Black nuns to establish themselves in the United States. And when the first representatives of the first order of Black nuns who were also Haitian,
Hmm.
visited New Orleans, and during Reconstruction, Dr. Fagé treated them during a yellow fever epidemic, and they recovered.
Yeah.
So one of the big things, one of the major things that I discovered in my study that I didn't know before is the enormous impact of
Hmm.
Saint-Domingue Haitian that migrations.
Yeah.
It was just enormously important. So and I didn't realize it until like the end, and I thought, oh, wait a minute. I'm talking about all of these refugees, white and
Hmm.
black, and from the Haitian Revolution. And uh, okay, I mean, it just
Yeah.
dawned on me how enormously important they've been, and not only during the revolutionary years and
Hmm.
Civil War and all of that, but up until the present.
Right.
Because in 2022, uh, the a descendant of Homer Plessy. Do you know who
Mhm.
Homer Plessy
Yep.
is in the
Yep. Yep.
Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court
Well, I hope all my listeners know.
in 1896, who uh, declared a Louisiana law valid, the Plessy versus
Yeah.
Ferguson case, which segregated
Hmm.
persons on railway cars. And so the person who was uh, 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 um, recruited
Hmm.
to challenge this law was Homer Plessy. So
Right.
that's how the Supreme Court decision. He was of Haitian ancestry as well.
Oh.
And so
Once you start looking, they suddenly appear
I'm telling
everywhere,
you,
don't they?
yeah. And then the
Yeah.
in 2022, a descendant of his, Keith Plessy,
Hmm.
uh, worked to have he was fined. Homer Plessy in 1790 was fined $25 for violating the separate call law. So what Homer Plessy did just recently here in a very moving ceremony was to have that penalty overturned. In other
Hmm.
words, the law under which he had been, or the penalty that he had suffered was
Yeah.
removed from his
Nice.
name.
Yeah.
So
We're a
very moving.
long way still towards
Yeah.
righting some
And
of the wrongs done.
yes, and not only that, but the attorneys that fought through after
Hmm.
1900, the attorneys that fought uh, the that fought segregation and inequality
Hmm.
in teacher pay and all of that was A.P. Turo and his young son, uh, uh, A.P. Turo Jr. desegregated LSU in
Oh,
the yeah, in the
well, there we go.
1950s. Desegregated, very young, a very
Yeah.
traumatic experience. I mean, at that time still.
Yeah.
So
I'm still waiting for LSU to put a building named after Sherman up, so
do what?
I'm still waiting on LSU to put up a building named after William T. Sherman. So until that happens, I'm not going to give him too much credit
Oh,
yet.
there has been a building named after Turo, A.P. Turo.
Yeah, and they
Uh-huh. In
should.
fact, I'm getting ready to go to a ceremony for whereby his son is turning over documents of the family
Oh,
to
good.
LSU. Yeah. So
Nice.
I'm really looking
I hope
forward
they
to that.
don't store that on that leaky floor of theirs.
I hope so too,
Yeah,
surely.
that would be bad. Um, let's see here. Let's talk briefly about Butler.
Oh,
We're just
wow.
going to talk briefly about Butler with regard
Okay.
to because I found Butler is such a lightning rod of a person because I have I had oh now I'm going to blank on her name. She's going to hate me for it, but I had an interview with the author of his most recent biography. I recently talked with somebody, and they were very anti-Butler with sort of the first weeks of the Civil War, and now I have you who also likes has Butler in it, and like Butler seems like he appears if you look closely, if you study the right areas, he's everywhere. But Butler for you has sort of a couple of really important contributions.
Oh, yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm just going to let you pick like what do you think are the for your stories, the two most important contributions that Butler makes with regard to New Orleans?
Okay, well, he did a lot. Dr. Charles Roudanet, educated at the Faculty of Medicine de Paris, who had seen the 1848 revolution, um, he started a newspaper, and as soon as and Butler gave him a subsidy for it, and it maintained that slavery needed to be abolished. And slavery gave him another subsidy later on to support the newspaper and his agenda, very radical agenda. And what Roudanet wanted was a revolution. And I see Butler as assisting him to the extent that he could in achieving that revolution. I think one of the most interesting things for me is that enslaved New Orleanians turned up immediately at his encampment
Mm-hmm.
once he occupied the city. And Butler listened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that before long, he had eyes and ears in every household in the city. And so they were his informants.
Mm-hmm.
And then he established a perimeter around the city to keep the city stable to the extent that he could, and to
Mm-hmm.
keep the rural workers out and everybody, just the perimeter. But Black enslaved men fought their way into the city, and he made the decision, well, if they're going to try to fight us, we'll put them in the U.S. Army so they can fight the enemy.
Yeah.
And so he recruited like 2,000 men. And remind you, he was only there 9 months. Okay. He did extraordinary things.
Mm-hmm.
He recruited free and enslaved soldiers into 3
Mm-hmm.
regiments, and he named 76 commissioned officers. Consider that in the commission to African American soldiers. And recruitment, uh, you know, commissioned soldiers, Black United States Army, the United States, had recruited
Right.
to the Army. So what he did, what he considered considered revolution.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. So and of course he's subsidizing this abolitionist newspaper, really. That made President Lincoln very anxious about what he
Mm-hmm.
was doing. He was having success with his Black soldiers in the west part of the
Mm-hmm.
region. There was um, a blockade run. The United States attempted to block the, and so what they did was send his soldiers, his Black soldiers, over there to
Yeah.
stop that. Were successful.
Yeah.
So we don't hear about that, though. It seems to me often, although there are 2 books about Butler.
Mm-hmm.
Bulldozing is one of them by Adam Fairclough. I don't know if you're
Mm-hmm.
familiar with that book.
Yeah.
And another one by a woman scholar, and I can't think of the name of her book.
Yes, I
In
know.
any event, they're revisionist, okay? They're
Mm-hmm.
revisionist. So yeah, really a very interesting, and he never forgot Americans. He had medals coined for soldiers that distinguished themselves. He was in Congress and supported legislation that favored Americans.
Right.
He was an extraordinary man, and but like that office, 6 of the officers were commissioned. 100, the
Yeah.
total number of Black commissions officers. I found that extraordinary.
Yes. Now I'm going to redeem myself. Elizabeth Leonard, Benjamin Butler's biographies that we were both thinking about. Yes. But in
Trifute?
the
Go ahead.
Elizabeth Leonard for a noisy, fearless life. That was what she termed Butler's subtitled her book about Butler.
Oh,
But yeah, and it again, it's such a fascinating, like I'm going to let people read that section in your book because there's so many interesting facets and stories. But to get to, as we're drawing towards the end here, I want to kind of pull back a little bit and look at your title one more time, because you call it the Revolutionary Atlantic. And so
mhm.
many studies about the Age of Revolutions are like, yes, we start with the American Revolution in around 1776, but we're going to end around 1825 when Spanish America gets its independence. And you're saying and then there's been some challenge to say, like, well, maybe 1848 could be a good end point too, but you're going to the 1870s to say, let's really go like towards the end of Reconstruction. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so, question being, how do you see Reconstruction as sort of that culmination, I guess, of this age of revolution?
Yes, I do. And that's because during Reconstruction, uh, fully half of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were Black,
Mm-hmm,
and one-third of the members of the House of Representatives were Black in
mm-hmm,
Reconstruction. The state treasurer of Reconstruction, or during the Reconstruction period, was Black. And the lieutenant governor, who served as governor, Oscar Dunn, that's a brand new, uh, so was Black. And a close
mm-hmm,
ally of Ulysses S. Grant, know that. So this new sheds light on all of that. Is Brian Mitchell is Monumental is the title of the book. And so there were all of the extraordinary gains,
mm-hmm,
and nowhere else in the 19th century Western sphere did African Americans achieve genuine political power,
mm-hmm.
except post-revolutionary Haiti.
Right.
Okay. So in that sense, I would say that I am justified in considering their things revolutionary. There's other things in their constitution. You were an oath of office to accept the civil equality of all men.
Mm-hmm,
All citizens equal access in places of accommodation.
mm-hmm,
Orleans was the only city to desegregate public schools, which 7 years.
mm-hmm,
They established an interracial metropolitan police force.
mm-hmm,
In 1869, they had chartered university, which is present, and in a middle school as well.
mm-hmm,
And it was run by none other than Dr. Charles Louis Benet, the famous Dr. Benet, trained at the uh, Paris, the Faculté de Médecine de Paris. So,
mm-hmm,
at which he passed on his thinking and his way of treating patients onto his students. So, I think that that's qualifies, I think that that
mm-hmm,
qualifies all of these things can be considered revolutionary. And were seen as, and the most important thing was the Black New Orleanians saw the
mm-hmm,
Civil War as an opportunity. And 4 million men, women, and children liberated from slavery. I mean, when you look at the large picture here, I know that there is a objection to considering all of this revolutionary, but I'm hoping that I'll change that view, because I don't think it's proper in this, or applies rather to Louisiana, let's
Right.
say.
No, and I think you're laying out an excellent case to kind of say that we have these individuals from Haiti who are coming to Louisiana and they're wanting to bring more change to the territory. And Reconstruction, I always think of as sort of that great moment of hope, right? Of like,
Okay.
maybe we get racial equality, maybe we can achieve like a better society. And in the end, it doesn't last, but there
Right.
is that brief moment where you have that hope and that moment where you have that opportunity. And individuals who have been at the forefront of all of these changes are at the
Yes.
forefront of this one as well.
Right. Well, yeah, of course, then you have to take into account the terrible violence, right, that
Yes.
ensued. I mean, there
Hmm.
were repeated street battles,
Yeah.
terrible massacres.
Yeah.
And so at one point, Oscar Dunn, the lieutenant governor, wondered if he should encourage his supporters to vote
Yeah.
because the violence was so terrible. And
Hmm.
both Dr. Fagé and Dr. Boudinot sent their families rather. Uh, Dr. Boudinot sent his family to France, and Dr. Fagé his family to California because things were so terrible in
Yeah.
the city.
Yeah. And it's still an aspect that like reconstruction needs still a lot of work with regard to just just New Orleans, like the Battle of Liberty Place and the fighting there is that we need a lot
Yeah,
more kind of understanding of what how it fits sort
uh,
of the larger narratives of kind of this revolutionary change.
right. And of course, just like well, not just like today, but very much it reminds me of today, these Supreme Court decisions
Hmm.
that turned the protection of
Yeah.
rights back to the states, to
Hmm.
rebel governments, because they took over in
Yeah.
New Orleans.
Yeah.
And the Cruikshank, the 876 Cruikshank decision, rather, in which no white person could be punished for killing a black, killing a black. So it gave a green light to acts of
Yeah.
terrorism.
Hmm.
And the 1877 removal of federal troops from New Orleans,
Yeah.
which was the state capital, resulted in a coup d'etat. The final there were many attempts,
Right.
many coup d'etat attempts, but the one in 1870 was the
Yeah.
one that ended it all.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a Supreme Court decision, but anyway, it was all of these
But
other Supreme Court decisions
right.
led to uh, uh, to
Yeah, and
pro-Confederate uh, pro-Confederate folks.
yeah, and I guess in the end, one of the big takeaways from your book had got to be that how fragile democracy is and how important it is to
Yes,
defend that
yes,
democracy
yes,
and the political achievements that we have
yes,
made.
yes.
So,
Right. Yep,
um,
absolutely.
at this stage, Caryn, it was a great pleasure to have you today. Again, thank you for interrupting your Mardi Gras celebrations.
Thank you.
Um,
It's been a real pleasure for me too. Thank you so much.
it's if you're interested in the book for my listeners, it's Creole New Orleans in the Revolutionary Atlantic,
Let me show a picture.
1775 to 1877. It is available at LSU Press and other places as well. If you're watching the video, Caryn has held up a book copy
Beautiful
of it.
cover.
It's a beautiful cover, actually. I'll put that into my thumbnail for the episode as well.
Oh, great.
Um, with that, Caryn, thank you so much.
Thank you.